Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor. And it's Wednesday, which means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book graphic novel or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about that same graphic novel, comic book, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week is a very special episode because we're talking about a bona fide comic book masterpiece. It's this one. It's Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons created this masterpiece of comics. Now, is this graphic novel actually a masterpiece? Is it, as it has been hyped for years, the greatest graphic novel ever created? Probably. It's definitely a masterpiece. Let's face it. It is. All that hype you hear, it is mostly justified. And it could be the greatest graphic novel ever written. Although, if you have a different opinion, I'd like to hear it. Because this certainly is an incredible story by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. This superhero story that starts off as a superhero mystery. It's an interesting comic book. Basically, this started in 1986, the year when a lot of crazy stuff happened in comic books. There were a lot of changes going on in comic books at that specific time. Around that time, we got The Dark Knight Returns from Frank Miller. We got Crisis on Infinite Earths, which wiped out and restarted the DC Comics universe. And we had this miniseries. So DC Comics had acquired the superheroes from Charlton Comics. Comic book characters like The Question and Blue Beetle. And so this series was originally Alan Moore telling a story with the Charlton characters. But it soon became apparent that it was a very, very dark story, and a lot of those characters would be unusable after the story. So what they did is they transformed the Charlton characters into these other original characters. For example, Blue Beetle became Night Owl, and The Question became Rorschach. Rorschach? I can never pronounce Rorschach's name, so I'm going to just mispronounce it. I've heard it pronounced, and I still can't pronounce it. I know. Anyway, Rorschach. Something like that. Anyway, I remember specifically when this miniseries came out because I was huge into comic books at the time. And when this first issue came out, it was an interesting looking issue. That was the cover for issue number 1. And it told an interesting mystery story. Basically, it starts off as a mystery. A superhero, or an ex-superhero, has been murdered. And his body is thrown out a window from his apartment building. Later on, our mysterious hero Rorschach, whatever his name is, he comes through the window because he's investigating, and he discovers that this guy that was thrown out the window was a superhero that he knows, the comedian. And so he believes that somebody is killing off superheroes or ex-superheroes. So the thing about this story is it takes place in a world where superheroes exist, but it's modeled very closely on our world until the point when the superheroes show up. And then the superheroes change history, particularly the one superhero in this comic that has superpowers, which would be Dr. Manhattan there. He changes everything, this character. Now, this is a comic book that I'm going to try hard not to give spoilers for the story, because I've discovered that even though this has such a tremendous reputation, there's an awful lot of people that haven't read it, which surprises me. You should read this. Definitely you should read this. I still have all the issues that I bought as they were coming out. And it became apparent pretty early on in this series just how groundbreaking this series was. It's hard to believe there was a time when this didn't exist, but I remember specifically this coming out. And how the first issue was intriguing, but it started getting exciting as the issues came out and we saw what kind of story this was telling. That this was a story about superheroes, but not as we would expect them to be. This is a book that kind of takes the idea that Stan Lee had about superheroes that existed in a more realistic world and superheroes that had real problems, and just dials that up to 11 and makes everything really, 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 really dark. It's a dark story. And that was different at the time. And this changed everything in comics. I think as far as comic books are concerned, this one comic book probably changed more about comic books than any other comic book that came out in the 80s. Even more than Dark Knight Returns. This one was and has proven to be the most influential. Not always has that been a good thing. The reason this worked is because it existed in a separate universe. This was not the DC universe. It wasn't even the Charlton universe, even though these characters are obviously based off those characters. This existed in its own universe. And I don't think the book would have worked at all if you didn't have Dave Gibbons as the artist. The artwork in this is fantastic, all the way through, very detailed. Now, one interesting thing about this comic book is just how structured it is, in that pretty much the whole thing is in a 9-panel layout, which is something that you saw in the old Spider-Man comic books a lot. This kind of comic book layout is kind of cramped, but if you've got the right artist, you can tell a lot of story with this many panels. And so you'll have the basic 9-panel structure, and then you would work with that. Sometimes you would shift 2 panels and make 2 panels into 1 panel, or 3 panels into 1 panel, and then you have the 3 panel on the bottom. But you just did variations of the 9-panel page layout all through this book, and that's how this book is structured. As far as the storytelling, it's interesting as well. You have this complicated mystery story that becomes more and more complex and convoluted and seems darker and darker all the time. But basically you have a 12-issue series with 6 issues worth of plot, and alternating between the main plot are the stories of the superheroes themselves. You'll have an origin story for Dr. Manhattan, for example, or for Rorschach, whatever his name is. Anyway, you'll have the stories of these characters. And it works really well. It's a great comic book. Everything you've heard about how great this is, it's just that great. Is it perfect? No. And we realized that, I think, as we were reading it as readers. There were bits and pieces of this that you just had seen other places. Even back then, in 1986 and 1987 when it came out, there were things in this that you saw other places and that Alan Moore just seemed to be using, and not caring that these bits that he was using were not original at all. Like when Rorschach kills this perverted child murderer, he does it the same way Mad Max does in the original Mad Max movie. I mean, it's the exact same thing practically. Clearly, that's where he got it. And there are bits like that in this story. Most notoriously, the ending of this. I can't make you realize now that the way this is available now is, of course, as a book with 12 chapters that you can read, in a couple days or whatever. It took us, when we first got this, a year. It was a year to get this story done. And every month, trust me, we were looking forward to the next issue to find out what was going to happen. And then we got to the end. And it sucked. So, just so you know, the reason it sucks is that, as was perfectly clear to anybody reading this at the time, this ending is straight out of an Outer Limits episode. It is just lifted right out of an Outer Limits episode. Something that they knew. And Len Wein brought this up to Alan Moore and said, this is all according to Len Wein, who was an editor on the book. He said, you can do something different. You can do something original. And Alan Moore said, screw you. I'm going to do it this way because this is the way I want to do it. And Len Wein, according to Len Wein, was so pissed off that he actually left the book because this was obviously the ending was obviously this Outer Limits episode. It was a complete copy of that episode's main story. And obviously so. And it wasn't all that great even then, even if you knew where it was, even if you didn't know where it came from, you would be like, really? So it's no surprise that when the film was finally made, the film changed the ending. And actually, the one thing that film did get right, I think, was the ending, and that they did make a better ending than this. I mean, it wouldn't take much, but the film, I think, had a better ending. Nothing else in the movie was better than this, but the film, yeah. Yeah, I can't describe the disappointment that we as readers had after reading this for a year, and it was just amazing most of the way through, and then you get that ending and you're like, what the no. There's got to be a 13th episode or something. No, it was 12 issues. So, but other than that, and a few minor quibbles, this is amazing. And like I said, the influence of this has not always been positive. As I said, this took place in its own universe, so it worked. It was okay. But the problem is, this was tremendously successful. I sort of wish it wasn't. I sort of wish it was like this underground thing that a few of us knew about, and wasn't that great? Yeah, that was amazing. But no, this was a huge hit, and DC Comics has been making major cash on this ever since. And they've exploited that as much as they could, making horrifically bad sequels and putting Watchmen characters into the regular DC universe, which is never something that should happen. And then they made some TV show that was like a sequel. But the worst thing that this did is that because this was great and was so popular and made so much money, DC started doing this kind of thing, or at least attempting to, in their regular comics. Probably, for me, the worst example for that, the most notoriously god-awful example of that, is Identity Crisis, which basically was ripping a bunch of this off and putting it in that story, using regular DC Comics characters in a way that DC Comics characters were never meant to be used. And for me, at least, it was damaging. I don't think DC Comics has ever recovered from that. I don't blame Alan Moore for that. I think maybe Alan Moore blames Alan Moore for that sometimes. But like I said, this took place in its own universe. There's no reason this shouldn't have existed, and I'm glad it does because it's amazing. Unfortunately, the result of it is not always great in other comic books. But this is fantastic. Highly recommend it. Very detailed story. It's just incredible. I don't want to give too much of it away. I already gave away that it has a crappy ending, but that's just so you won't be surprised. But the individual characters in this story, they each have their own stories. And those are all tremendously interesting. And the artwork is amazing and very detailed. And there's a lot of interesting things that are done in this comic that are done by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, who does not get enough credit for the work in this, because I literally don't think that this book would have worked at all if you had had a different artist. It just wouldn't, I don't think. I mean, everything about the way this is done artistically is amazing. So I guess that's all I have to say about Watchmen. Check out Steve Donoghue. He'll have much more to say about it. But yes, legitimate masterpiece. Flawed masterpiece? Yes. Does it have things that aren't so great in it? Yeah. But that's all right. It's still amazing, as everybody has said. And it is considered one of the greatest, not just graphic novels, but I've heard it said that it's considered one of the greatest novels ever. It's a comic book. Let's get real, guys. This is a comic book. It's a great one. It's a great comic book. One of the best comic books of all time. It's a comic book. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.